And I'll be turning to Robert Mwali first, and he's a public finance researcher at Center for Trade and Policy Development. And so, Robert, I want to really for you to give us a deep dive into the amazing research that you've done on Zambia's case, leading us from the debt forgiveness in the early 2000s under the highly poor indebted countries to the defaulting of payment in 2021, I think, and then also the common framework process. And also maybe to give us a first-hand understanding of what this has really also meant for Zambians. Thank you so much. Over to you, Robert.
Thank you so much once again for the opportunity to actually share some perspective from on Zambia as regard to the entire process in terms of the debt situation from the HIPC all the way up to where we currently stand as a country. So basically, I think I will put my response in 5 categories or sub category. The first one is the situation that existed before we actually got to the HIPC. I think all of us know that Zambia as a country got independence in 1964, and after we got independence in 1964, if you look at our country, we are heavily dependent on copper, and so that heavy dependence during the 1960s all the way to the 1970s. At that time, our copper was doing so fine on the international market. And because of that, we had a strong economy, and as a country, I think growth was something that we were able to easily attain. And as we go to the 1970s, in 1973 to be specific, we had the Arab oil embargo, and it was actually during this period in the 1970s to 1980s when Kaunda, who was then the president of the country, nationalized the mining sector. So what that meant, the mining industry, what that meant is that the government had a huge stake in the mining activities. But I think the challenge that happened is that at that very point, our copper prices started to decline. And there was a lot of mismanagement in terms of the returns or the revenues that were coming from the mines. And in order to supplement that, government went into a lot of accumulation or borrowing. They contracted so much debt. And at the same time, inflation levels became extremely high, and the levels of unemployment surged within the country. And the government then had to go to the IMF in the 1980s to go for a program that was called the Structural Adjustment Program. And so in the 1980s to the 1990, we were on a program of the Structural Adjustment Plan, where we needed now to deal with certain things as given by those that were willing to actually fund us. And as we go to 2000, I think we had hit the HIPC mark, and then we began to implement some of those programs. And as we got to 2004, we hit the HIPC completion point. And so when we hit the HIPC completion point, what that meant is that all the debts that we were owing, part of the debts that we were owing to the private and the bilateral creditors, they were actually cancelled out. And what you'll notice is that our debt levels at that point exceeded 150% of our debt to export ratio. And so after we got that cancellation, is that our debt levels reduced by 50 to 55%. But what you're going to note is that when you look at the combinations of the debtors that the creditors that we had as a country, the composition of our debt at the point that we hit the completion point of the HIPC is that 45% of our debt composed of the multi-laterals. And then 15% of that debt was private, and the rest of the debt was the bilateral debt that we are owing. And then the way the global financial architecture is that the multilateral lenders, such as the IMF and the World Bank, these are not they have a preferential creditor status. What that means is that in a time of a crisis like this, all the debts that we owe to them cannot be cancelled because they are given that preferential status over the other debtors, mainly because the claim is that these actually lend even in the time of a crisis. So to supplement then the HIPC, which is the heavily indebted poor countries initiative, this was actually supplemented with what was called as a multilateral debt initiative. And basically what that initiative meant is that through that initiative, after the country had reached the HIPC, it also qualified to have its debt actually cancelled under this initiative. And so what we noted is that Zambia benefited not only from the heavily indebted poor country initiative, but it also benefited from the multilateral debt relief initiative called MDRI. So what that meant, after all this, our debt levels actually reduced to below 20% of our GDP. And we were, as a country, starting on a sort of a clean slate with almost zero public debt. But what you're going to note is that as we get to the 2008, there was a global financial crisis. And then later on, because in 2010, 2011, during this period, our copper on the international market was doing well. And our credit rating had actually improved because of the debt levels that were extremely lower after the HIPC as well as the MDRI that we benefited from between 2004 and 2005. Then there was growing appetite in the country to go again on the international market now, this time around, to borrow. So what we did is that we moved away from concessional debts, and now we went to the commercial debts that were pegged on the market prices. And then the critical cases in point is the Euro bonds, the 3 Euro bonds that we got as a country, totaling about $3 billion US. So in 2012, we borrowed the 750 million bond that was pegged at 5.7 thereabout coupon price in terms of the interest that we're supposed to pay. In 2014, we got a 1 billion that was at over 8.8% interest. And in 2015, we also went back on the market and borrowed again another bond of about 1.25 billion US at an interest that was now closer to about 9%. And those are higher interest amounts. And so between 2016 to 2021, even our appetite to borrow on the domestic market actually increased to an extent that as we go to 2019, it was very clear that we were not going to be able to pay out our debts. And so what you note is that governments then in 2020 requested to have our interest payment suspended. Instead of us paying it in 2020, we requested that it be suspended for us to actually pay it in about in April 2021. But I think there were some creditors, especially I think most of them were from Europe, that actually refused for that to be done in August of 2020. And because of that refusal, by the time we are getting to November 2020, we actually failed to make a payment on the first coupon of the 42 million dollars thereabout. And then we were entered into a default as a country. And then what you're going to notice that the background to this is that we were just coming from the COVID era. And because with the COVID, inflation in our country had actually gone up to about 19.2% in 2020. And not only that, our kwacha had actually depreciated by 64% from 12.9 kwacha per dollar to about 21.1 per dollar. And that's how, what that meant is that what we had borrowed, because we are supposed to pay then in dollars, the 42 million US dollars kwacha equivalent meant that our cost was extremely high compared to how much we were supposed to pay in 2012. And that sort of put us in a very awkward situation. And then we defaulted. And after we defaulted then, what we noted then is that as a country, we went into, we made a formal request in 2021 to go on down the G20 Common Framework. And when an assessment was done, it was actually found that our debt levels were sitting primarily beyond around 33 billion. And the major component of it, 18 billion was external debt. Meanwhile, the other 15 billion was domestic debt. And that is where we were sitting as a country. And then when you look at these debt levels, when we went into the restructuring, quickly in the interest of time, when we went into the restructuring, the three bonds, the total amount of debt that was earmarked for restructuring was 12.03 billion US dollars. And out of this, what we are owing as a case in point to the bondholders, the 3 billion, that those three bonds were actually dismantled and put into two. And we had now a bond A and a bond B. And what is interesting when you look at the amortization of the bond A and the bond B is that when we begin to make some repayment, on bond B in 2051, 2052, and 2054, when this money become due, we are supposed to make equal installments each year of about $450 million. And then I want you to look at this. We are in a situation where in 2020, we couldn't manage to pay the 42 million coupon. And then in 2053, we are expected to actually meet every year $450 million for consecutive 3 years. And then when you look at even after us benefiting from the restructuring process that we have that we are in, it is important for us to actually put it into context. So the 94% of the debt that we have restructured under the Common Framework is basically agreements in principles. So meaning there's some sort of an agreement, but these are not legally binding. Then the agreements that are legally binding, where contracts have been signed, they are sitting at about 57%. What that means is that the other amounts that we haven't really worked on, if you look at them, is that there is what we owe from Afrizim Bank, the Eastern and Southern Trade and Development Bank. These banks also are Africa regional banks, and they're also claiming to have a preferred credit status, and they do not want their debt to actually be cut. And it is becoming increasingly difficult for us to actually manage different kind of creditors on the facility, the G20. And as we speak, I think Zambia's the AFRODAD is going for arbitration to deal with the case for Zambia. So in summary, what you're going to notice that despite us achieving the HIPC completion point and having our debt cancelled almost to our public debt reduced to almost zero, we in our appetite moved us from concessional to commercial lending, and then we borrowed recklessly beyond our ability to repay. And the framework that we went on, the G20 framework, has not been able to handle the complexity of our debtors and leading us to a prolonged situation that we are in right now. I think that's my submission.
Thank you so much, Robert. That is just extremely interesting. And then also, yeah, I think it illustrates many issues that has been brought up with the G20 Common Framework, right? As I said, how it gives preference to private creditors, and we've also explained how the process between 2000, the early 2000s to now, the debt landscape for Zambia has really changed. And we also see this across the global south, and especially in Africa, where we do have an appetite to borrow more from private creditors, and also how this process then has this haphazard way of dealing on it in a case by case, and then also not bringing all creditors around the table for ease of management. And so you have this piecemeal process, which is really then lengthening the debt resolution process, whilst not stopping the repayment process